This is Gender in Focus. I'm Elle, and each week I sit down with the president of Transfocus Consulting and all-round gender diversity genius, Kai Scott. I get to ask all the questions you've ever wanted to ask about how to make the workplace and the world a better place for trans and non-binary people. Let's get into it.
In today's episode, we are discussing the value and process related to introducing toolkits that outline how staff of an organization can be supportive of trans and non-binary people. Because the topic of gender diversity can be relatively new to some folks, it is important for organizations to document what support looks like. And it's not just at the obvious moments, like when somebody comes out as trans. We dive into the details surrounding this kind of powerful tool for clarity. I'm excited to jump in.
So I'd never actually heard of any kind of toolkit like this before I started working for Transfocus. So can you explain what the difference is between having the toolkit in place versus just having like a standard policy for diversity and inclusion?
Absolutely. Happy to clarify. Yeah, it can be a bit confusing. I mean, there's so many different words that are swirling about, right? Some people call it a transition guideline. Some people call it a policy. Others talk about, toolkit. And certainly we've rotated all of those different ways of describing this type of document. And where we've landed is toolkit, because policy can often feel fairly heavy-handed. For some folks who are just new on the topic, it's like, whoa, there's something like really heavy in place and it's very serious. And of course it is serious, but it's not coming with this supportive stance that a lot of people need when they're learning on something as what can be new to them about gender diversity. And so toolkit, it comes from like a very practical lens and really coming alongside folks to say, hey, you might not know, but X, Y, and Z, have you considered if you know somebody who's trans or if somebody's just coming out or any number of different scenarios that are at play and giving them proper answers or clarity on the topic rather than saying, thou shalt do X, Y, and Z. And people are like, oh dear, what if I don't do that? Will I, land up in jail? People can come from a very fear-based response to policy. Certainly, I appreciate why people want policy. They want to denote how important this topic is and give, some weight to the matter. But I think given how new this topic is for many people, it is important to be supportive rather than directive, and people tend to respond better to that. And we did veer away from calling it a transition guideline because it's not just about people coming out at work. And transition often denotes that it's about, what people conjure up in their mind is medical transition. And of course, not everybody medically transitions. And so we didn't want that to be the focal point. And sometimes people then ask unnecessary or private questions. And so just really want to focus on everyday support for trans folks. And that can come at different stages, but really just being that is the focal point for folks.
So you were talking about how the toolkit's not just addressing people who are coming out, but it's more of a kind of like overall look at supporting people who are trans and non-binary. Can you go over what those things are? If it's not just about coming out, if it's not just about medical transition, what is it about then?
Right. What other things can we talk about? I think a lot of the more obvious piece of information that people don't feel prepared to address is somebody coming out. So that tends to be like the thing that people want to put in the toolkit, which I appreciate. There are specifics to that process, and it's good to outline it for folks so that managers feel equipped and other people in the organization know what to expect, right? So it is good to talk about that, but that shouldn't be the only thing. Of course, support comes before somebody comes out at work, right? You should be actively creating a safe environment for folks to come out if they want to, or feel safe if they don't want to, right? Of course, coming out is not required. People can come out earlier in life and then never want to talk about it again, right? So that's perfectly legitimate, but of course still want a safe environment. So not hearing jokes about trans people and them being witness to those, and everyone thinking that in the room that there's no trans people, right? Which can be something that if you haven't set up a proper or cultivated a proper culture, those are things that can come up for folks that can be very chilling, either before or if they're not coming out at work. And so these are some of the things that you can actively, highlight for folks and to share and to help cultivate that culture. There's also after coming out, I think sometimes people think, well, just help somebody come out and then that's it. And then off they go into right into the sunset. And, certainly some people that's the case, but others will need continuous support, either because there's a lack of understanding or there's continuous misgendering that happens, or perhaps even instances where people push back on, we're seeing quite a bit of a backlash on trans and non-binary folks. And so these are some of the things that employees may need continuous support on and with, or just practical things like ongoing medical appointments, right? Where does that fit within the everyday flow of the work that they're doing? So these are some of the things that it's not kind of one and done. It's a continuous process, one that people will need support. And so we just try to map all of that out for folks so that it's on their radar. They know what to do no matter what level of the organization they're at, and to really be clear and in ways that are supportive and reassuring and really help people feel inspired to step up.
So I was looking over the toolkit and you've split it up into different sections, so systems, cultures, and communication. Do you mind going into those and why it's so important to have those as like separate focuses as opposed to just like assuming that everything will come together and just hope for the best?
No kidding. Yeah, it's so true. I mean, certainly the main framework that we use at Transfocus is separating culture and structure. And it's not to say that they're not linked. Certainly they are and do need to carefully kind of weave them together in some way. But it is good to look at them in their own respect. So the cultural is all about how we interact with one another, group dynamics, culture of the workplace. There's also the structural piece, which is just how are things set up, systems, spaces, procedures, like how do things work together. And what we found is that oftentimes people have a lot of questions on the cultural side, which is really important. And certainly toolkits do provide guidance on that and give suggestions. And, rather than if you're meeting somebody for the first time, don't assume their gender or their pronouns, right? Something very simple, very basic, but very important. If you misgender somebody, correct yourself, things like that, so that people can have that tangible know how to do things. But organizations should also look at the structural side, and that's where this toolkit kind of weaves all that together. Because in order to figure out how to help somebody come out, you then bump up quite literally into the especially systems, but you also have to talk about washrooms. So if you don't have all that structural stuff sorted out, or if you haven't thought about it, it then becomes this very unpleasant surprise for everybody. And so that's where we try to kind of tease those apart to say, okay, here are the steps to take, things to consider around setting up systems in a good way, whether it's having two first name fields, so that if somebody is in the process of changing their legal documentation, haven't quite done it because it takes a long time, it's costly, at least you have their chosen name for that time where they're changing their documents, which is typically a part of coming out process. So that's just one tangible example, but really to have sorted out both the cultural and the structural and then put them together in a toolkit that allows people to see, oh, okay, this is how we do things, and this is how we'll record those things in the systems and spaces that we've set up.
Have you come across any pushback or resistance to this. I guess for a lot of people, it would be, okay, we have a policy, so why do we need anything extra? So, yeah, have you come across any kind of pushback?
Sometimes when talking with leadership, they want to know the rationale. Certainly, I appreciate if you already have, say, a respectful workplace policy in place, like why add to it, right? It's already stated explicitly, no harassment, no bullying, et cetera, right? It's very clear. Now, I will say that it's really the devil's in the details when it comes to trans and non binary issues. Given that most people, it's not on their radar, it can be a bit surprising or they just know how to handle it. And so having a place that spells that out can be helpful, or a place for people to point and say, it seems like you're struggling with X that's addressed in this toolkit,
Right.
feel
Yeah.
free to read it in your own time and place, right? Another thing too is that there is education that's organizations are setting up, but because it's voluntary, not everybody shows up, right? And
Right.
so this is a backstop to people not being able to or not wanting to, or whatever the case may be, not attending education sessions. This is that, hey, this is the expectation that folks have, the standard that the organization has set on this topic. And so there doesn't leave any mystery as to where we're landing, where we want the culture to be in the organization. People aren't scratching their heads wondering. It's spelled out, right? Whether somebody attends an education session or not, it's there. It's a backup. I will say that, the pushback that we get is not so much should it be this, it's just that it feels like a lot. And it is. Usually these toolkits can range anywhere from 10 to plus pages, depending on how much detail is needed, especially around the coming out process. Usually that can amount to some, have some level of documentation or different places that need to be changed. You almost need to treat it like this person like a new employee, essentially, right? To think, especially if somebody has changed name, pronoun, gender category, you just think about all the places that would need to be updated. And especially in a large organization with so many different systems, it can have like huge cascading impact, right? So it just takes a lot, and people can feel a bit overwhelmed by the amount of content. And I will say it's probably not that everybody needs to read word for word, but that it's a resource available when specific things come up to be like, I wonder what we do in this situation. Oh, look, it spells it out here in chapter 2.1, right? And we go there.
Right.
We don't need to read necessarily everything else, but this time, this place requires that information and we have it available to ourselves. Another challenge that can come up is that people are not aware that the toolkit exists. So there's kind of beyond just creating it, there's also communication and developing awareness of the toolkit that's necessary. There's a few different levels and steps involved, a bit of a process to make it a successful tool available to folks. But yeah, I won't say that we've heard of a lot of pushback on the contents itself by employees. More often than not, what happens is employees are really thankful that it exists, right? Because most people are just wanting clarity. One way or another, just tell me what to do, right?
Sure.
Like spell it out for me. And for trans and non-binary folks, they're really thankful because now there's a process and it's not kind of a mystery. They don't feel like they have to do it themselves. They know that they can ask for help. They know that the organization will have their back. So there's not as much pushback there, but certainly leadership, just thinking it through, is a consideration.
I can imagine that it's super daunting to have to come out, or like people that I know who have done this, where they've come out in a workplace and they haven't had a toolkit in place. It can be a super daunting experience. So, can you kind of describe that, or like go into how this actually impacts trans people or trans and non-binary people?
Absolutely. So you're right. It is very daunting. And, no matter the circumstance, even with a toolkit, it's daunting.
Right.
But the toolkit takes off that edge that exists, right? Because coming out, for some, maybe not all, and it's like jumping off a cliff. So
Right.
if you don't feel like you have a set of wings or you don't have any mechanism to ride the currents, it feels like free fall, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so this toolkit is a set of wings that help people fly and thrive in an organization. And what we've heard time and time again is when there's not a toolkit in place and somebody comes out, they're like, I wish this was had been in place. That would have
Hmm.
really helped me, especially to know what to ask for. Because
Right.
oftentimes people have their sense of like, this is how I would like it to go, but it's never spelled out that they can assert that, right?
Hmm.
Um, I'm often people like off hours, trans people will approach me and be like, can I ask for this? I'm like, absolutely. And your employer really wants to know, hopefully, can't speak for all
Yeah.
employers, but certainly many of them want to know exactly how to support you, and spelling that out is really helpful for them.
Hmm.
And they ought to help you with that, And if there is a toolkit in place, what we find is as soon as something is introduced, like a toolkit, there's a wave of people who come out. Um,
Oh my
you
goodness.
know, maybe one, two, three. If it's a large organization, sometimes more. People are like, oh, finally, there's clarity here, and I feel
Hmm.
way more confident to show up fully at work. And I have a pathway that's been described to me, or it's been clarified that I can ask for things, and the organization will try their best to implement those or work with me. Um,
Hmm.
Especially spelling out that it's an employee driven process helps so that managers know that they're coming alongside rather
Hmm.
than dictating something. Like, be like, okay, this is what you have to do, steps 1, 2, 3, everybody the same.
Hmm.
That can often feel very restrictive in a way that almost replicates the harm from being
Right.
misunderstood all the way along.
Yeah. And also
So
hard for, I imagine, for a manager too, because they
mm,
don't know what you need. So
yeah.
it must feel really sort of hard for both sides there.
Oh, managers are freaked out. Like,
Right.
this is no understatement. Anytime, and this is we know this because we support quite a few coming out processes.
Hmm.
It's not certainly our first service offering, right? We
Sure.
want to have organizations be independent, be able to handle their own coming out processes. But certainly, if needed, we can come alongside and support. But what we just see is just HR, human resources, and managers, deer in headlights, just like, I, I know trans people exist. I never thought they'd come through the door, and I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do right now, preferably yesterday. And no, I mean, but people are really, really concerned because
Hmm.
they recognize that trans people have our protections under the law here in Canada, and so they want not only to avoid any legal trouble, but they also want to do right by the trans person, but have no benchmark for how that
Hmm.
happens. Um, and so they kind of tap in the dark unless they bring us in or have any other tool. But if they've thought it through and written it down in a toolkit, it's that much easier. It's not a bad of an eye. Like, oh yeah, of course, let's sit down, let's chat. And it's
Yeah.
such a relief for everybody because there's a framework that supports that journey for everybody involved.
Could you give us a sort of idea of like a real life scenario of what this looks like for an employee or for an organization? If somebody is thinking about coming out, or just kind of like from start to finish, having
Mhm.
this toolkit in place, how that can benefit people.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few scenarios that can come up. One example before somebody comes out is uh, maybe they'll put something on social media, and there's that fluidity between work and personal, where some employees are friends on, say, Facebook or Instagram, and they may notice, oh, this
Hmm.
person has changed their name and/or their pronouns, um, and now what? We work
Right.
together. Like, what do I do? Like, I have this piece of information. It is publicly available. And so some people might feel inclined to kind of raise that at work. Again, coming from a good place, but maybe not giving agency to that trans or non-binary person. And so they're just trying to figure out what to do, how to be supportive, and may misstep if they don't have clarity around it. As in, if you know that person really well, maybe approaching them and saying, I noticed this on your Facebook, Instagram, tell me more if you want to, or is there, anything you want me to do with regard to work, right? And just have that conversation and have them break it down. Be like, no, I want to wait. I'm not ready to come out at work. So please keep that private, and respecting those wishes. Or, yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way to bring it up work, but I don't know how to do that. And then, in which case, you can say, hey, if you want me to accompany you to any meetings, happy to be there for you, et cetera, et cetera. If you're not close to that person, it's just keep it in Facebook, Instagram land, right? Like, and leave that person to take the journey that they need and want. And so these are some of the things that are unpacked in the toolkit to provide that clarity, because there's these overlap. Okay, but let's say that person then becomes ready to share at work. And usually people approach their manager first and say, hey, I want to share this with my team, maybe a wider part of the organization, or maybe all of the organization. How do I do that? And then if they've got a toolkit that'll outline the various options that are available, the manager then can go through those options with that person. Maybe it's an email announcement. Maybe there's an education session, or it's in a team meeting, or it's in a newsletter. There's like thousands of different ways to share this information. And so, having that discussion, any other needs that they have, then talking about how are we going to update this information? When are we going to update this information? Legal name change versus chosen name, right? There's things that people wonder about, like surgeries, or gender affirming care, how much or whether to talk about those. And certainly you can talk about time off. That's really important. That's practical. Somebody is doing a major surgery and is going to be off for 6 weeks. You got to talk about that, right?
Sure.
But we're not talking about what procedure, right? That's private information. And so not kind of going overboard on wanting all those details. But certainly, how are we going to do time off? Is it supported? Short-term disability, right? There's also things like washrooms. People wonder how to navigate that as managers or even human resources. Generally, it's really helpful to talk about if the employee foresees any challenges in accessing washrooms that are for them, right? We're not asking which ones, but we're just asking access, and whether they see any challenge and how to create support for that access, right? So it's just unpacking some of these practical things during the coming out process. And then after coming out, it's really important to continue to check in with the person. It's been a month. How are you doing? Is everything going as planned? Do we need to adjust things? Are there any surprises? What are things that you're really excited about, right? So just filling out that picture, because oftentimes manager are like, whew, coming out's done. That's it. And then the trans person, typically we find in the research that we do, they're not going to come, and usually it's very difficult to share challenges that are happening, especially if they involve colleagues, right? We don't want to make trouble for colleagues, but there are things that are upsetting, right? And so if you have kind of the manager or human resources are looping back, that can often open that conversation in an easier way. So these are some of the things before, during, and after that are at play. Certainly not everything, but just gives you some flavor of what's in the toolkit that can be spelled out for folks, whether managers, colleagues of trans and non-binary folks, or trans and non-binary folks themselves.
There is a little bit in the toolkit that you've put together that talks about what you shouldn't ask,
Mm,
and things that you need to not you can it's an inside thought.
mm,
You
mhm.
don't need to actually put it out there, and you've mentioned that a couple of times just then, just these questions that you might be interested in but are really not appropriate to ask. Would you mind just going into that a little bit further and like why that's so important?
Yeah, it again goes back to most people have not knowingly encountered a trans person. And
Hmm.
so when somebody comes out, it's like, holy smokes, finally we have source of information for all of my questions ever on this topic. And certainly they're mounting because we see it in the media and we see,
Hmm.
legislative changes and, it's just like a swirling mystery. And so trans people in front of like that's very powerful, and I understand why people are very curious and they want to know more about their fellow person. And again, it's not a bad thing. We've talked about this in other episodes, but certainly especially at the outset, it's really important just to kind of go at the pace of the person in front of you. They're probably already overwhelmed by having come out. There's a lot to
Hmm.
it. There's a lot going on. Lots is changing. It could be stuff at work. It could be stuff at home. And so then having people pelting additional questions, trying to get their education on this topic can feel like a lot, right? So we just
Hmm.
want to avoid that scenario. Um, Certainly, people are very curious about gender affirming care, but just recognizing that not everybody accesses that or needs to. So the question I got when I first came out a lot was, "Have you had the surgery?" People think that there's just one, and that they thought it was appropriate to ask in the workplace about gender affirming care, very deeply personal decision making, and assuming that I was going to. It's just, yeah, not going down that line of inquiry. Pretty much with anybody at work, it's a safe bet, just like any other medical procedure. It's very personal, very private. Um, Other topics that I think are I would steer people away from are dating and personal life. So people are very curious about trans people dating. How does that work? What issues come up? Certainly we could do a whole nother podcast just on that topic. It is very full, shall we say.
Hmm.
Um, but it is very tricky and can be a source of a lot of pain for trans and non-binary folks. And so the degree to which they want to get into that at work is probably slimmer, right?
Sure.
Of course, I won't make a hard and fast, like always rule, but I would say on the whole, especially if you don't know that person, it's definitely steer clear of that. And family too. Certainly more and more people are accepting, but that's not everyone. And so some families can, there can be family rifts over people being trans, which is very sad, very hard reality. And even if they're not family rifts, there can be tensions that arise. And so just being sensitive to those and not forefronting those questions that you might have about family reality. Of course, if somebody trans and non-binary starts to share about that willingly of their own accord, that's where you can be more supportive and listen and, you know, be
Hmm.
feel honored that you're hearing that story. That definitely means that that person trusts you, and so to take that and safeguard that information and that storytelling, and affirm them too, and validate their feelings related to it. But certainly not us driving the
Hmm.
questions. It's that person sharing if they want to.
Any final thoughts on toolkits, Kai?
Toolkits are the best. No, no, no. I mean, toolkits are an important tool. Of course, they're not the only thing. Just because you have a toolkit doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to suddenly do things automatically based on the guidance provided, but it is an important anchoring point that provides the direction that an organization is heading in and can help people orient themselves, whether a manager, human resources, a trans or non-binary person. And so it's a pretty pivotal tool in the whole set for folks. So definitely recommend that organizations look at that. There is a process that's involved in creating one and then implementing it. We at Transfocus definitely help with those, both the creation of it. We have templates that we make available that organization can tailor to their organizational needs. And then we help with the implementation, educating on the toolkit so that managers and human resources are ready to action in case that a need arises. So it's not kind of out of left field, a mystery, wondering what to do. It's very clear and like, here we go. We've got the steps in place. And we've also sorted out a few of the systems pieces to make that possible. So those are my final thoughts on this topic.
Great. We do share a lot of information that is packed into the toolkit through social media. So where can everyone find you, Kai?
Absolutely. So we're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, TikTok. I'm sure I'm missing one of the others. There's a few we're on. But anyway,
everywhere.
Pretty much. You choose, you'll find us there. And definitely also join our newsletter where we have monthly tips and tools and a lot of free resources that, anywhere from 3 to 5 page documents that allow you to get a little bit deeper into things, have checklists or things to consider to deepen your allyship journey on this topic.
Great. Well, see you next week.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Bye for now.
See you later.